When Geoffrey of Monmouth recounts the final days of Arthur's reign, he tells of Modred's usurpation of the throne and his linking himself in unhallowed union with Guenevere the Queen in despite of her former marriage. After Arthur's return to Britain, when Guenevere hears that Modred has rallied his forces and marched into Winchester, she is smitten with despair and fled from York unto Carlion, where she proposed thenceforth to lead a chaste life among the nuns. In some of the chronicles that follow, Guenevere is more or less culpable. In Castlefort's chronicle, for example, she gives herself to Modred in spousebreak, adultery, unlawfully becomes his queen, and couples with him in lechery. Given her treason and sinfulness, it is no wonder that when she hears of Arthur's return to Britain, she flees to the nuns in the City of Legions and leads a chaste life among them. In Robert Manning of Brun's chronicle, after the queen betrays Arthur by becoming Modred's whore, the word of the chronicle, and Arthur returns to take vengeance on his sister's son, Guenevere enters a nunnery where she is hidden and locked away, that none of her more heard. Similarly, in the Prose Brute, she is said to make her way to Carlion, where she was never seen among his folk, her lief doring. What these representative works have in common is that Guenevere flees or slinks into seclusion in a nunnery, never to be heard from again. While there is the confrontation of battle between Arthur and Modred, there is no confrontation of any sort between the king and his queen. Similarly, when the chronicle tradition blossoms in the alliterative Maud Arthur, Modred writes to Guenevere telling her of Arthur's return and warning her to flee, whereupon she goes to Carlion and asks there the abbot in honor of Christ, and all for falsehood and fraud and fair of her lord. She is not heard from again, and there is no meeting between her and Arthur. Though the king does think of her in his dying moment and seems to forgive her. After ordering Modred's children to be slain, he says, "He forgive all grief for Christ's love of heaven. If we no have well wrath, well her betide." While the conditional nature of the forgiveness gives the line some ambiguity, it is striking that Arthur, who generally in the chronicle tradition thinks only of vengeance on his male rival, should have any thought at all for his queen. In the stanzaic Maud Arthur, there is a shift from Modred to Lancelot as the lover of Guenevere. As we move from the chronicle to the romance version of events, Modred concocts a story of Arthur's death so that he may be made king, and he intends to wed Guenevere, presumably to strengthen his claim to the throne. To avoid marrying him, she flees to the Tower of London. After the final battle, she goes to Almesbury to become a nun and leads a sad but holy life. Lancelot returns to Britain intending to help Arthur, but he is too late. He does, however, come to the nunnery at Almesbury, where the queen tells him, in a speech echoed by Malory, that he should return to his realm and take a wife. Because of his love for Guenevere, he refuses to do this and commits himself to the same kind of holy life that she has adopted. The author of the stanzaic Maud Arthur has added this dramatic and poignant meeting between the lovers who must renounce their love because of the tragedy it has caused. Malory adapts this scene in one of his most moving passages. Lancelot's exchange with Guenevere in the Mort expands upon the one in the stanzaic Mort. Malory's Guenevere seems unconvinced of the depth of Lancelot's love. She says, "But he may never believe you, but that ye will turn to the world again." Malory also has Lancelot link his love to his failure in the quest for the Grail, not so much as a complaint, but as a declaration of the depth of his love. "For in the quest of the Sangreal," he tells her, "he had that team forsaken the vanities of the world, had not your love abane." When Lancelot leaves the nunnery, he rode all that day and all night in a forest, weeping. But in Malory, as in the earlier text, there is no parting and no confrontation between Arthur and Guenevere. The dramatic possibilities of such an encounter are not, in fact, realized until the 19th century. The best known and most influential depiction of a final meeting between Arthur and his queen is found in Tennyson's Guenevere. Significantly, it is Arthur and not Lancelot who visits the queen after she has fled to the nunnery. Before the last battle, Arthur goes to Almesbury. As he approaches Guinevere's chamber, from off her seat she fell and groveled with her face against the floor. Because of her shame, she does not speak to Arthur, who has plenty to say to her. Thus the scene is in the form of a dramatic monologue rather than dialogue. Arthur presents a formidable, almost otherworldly figure. His helmet is crested with a golden dragon, and Guinevere, when she gets the courage to rise and look at him as he prepares to ride off, does not even see his face, which then was as an angel's, but she saw, wet with the mist and smitten by the lights, the dragon of the great Pendragon ship blaze, making all the night a steam of fire. In this scene, one of a number of great dramatic moments in the idyll, Arthur forgives Guinevere and says that he still loves her. But even as he does so, the blameless king blames her and reminds her that she has spoilt the purpose of my life. Of course, Arthur seems to us too stern. We remember Guinevere's earlier comment in the Lancelot and Elaine idyll, where she calls him the faultless king, that passionate perfection, but qualifies the compliment by adding, but who can gaze upon the sun in heaven? This sense of Arthur as too far above mortal men and women is enhanced even by his forgiveness. He says, I forgive thee as eternal God forgives. And as she grovels at his feet, she feels o'er her fallen hand the waving of his hands that blessed. While it is true that God forgives Guinevere, and as Ellie Crooks has argued in a recent article, that Guinevere's piety at the end of her life and the fact that Tennyson grants her entry into heaven position the queen as a fully redeemed and transformed figure in the eyes of God, it is also true, as Claire Broom Saunders has observed, that this conclusion fails to erase the idea of the prostrate queen. Perhaps this is so because the image of the groveling Guinevere is so striking and so dramatic. It was certainly one that was often depicted in art and popular culture. While Arthur speaks in Tennyson's text, Guinevere adds to the drama, if not by words, then by her body language, her groveling, and, when he pauses in his speech, her creeping an inch nearer and laying her hands about his feet. It is only when Arthur is riding off into the mist that Guinevere regains her voice and cries out, "O Arthur," and then admits that she thought she could not breathe in that fine air, that pure severity of perfect light, because she yearned for warmth and color, which she found in Lancelot, but that it was her duty to have loved the highest, and would have been her profit and her pleasure, had she only known and seen more. The entire Nunnery episode receives considerable attention in literature and art, including Guinevere's pious life as a nun, her painful conversation with the young novice, another of Tennyson's, sorry about that. That's the young novice. Another of Tennyson's masterly dramatic scenes, her grief as she realizes the extent of her flaw after Arthur leaves, Arthur's charge to the nuns and departure from the convent, and in this image you can see it at the bottom of this illuminated manuscript from the 19th century. And ultimately Guinevere's death. But the image I will focus on is that of Guinevere prostrate at Arthur's feet, an image that was depicted not quite as frequently as that of poor dead Elaine in her barge, but that was nearly equally recognizable. Whatever we may think of Guinevere's groveling, it certainly caught the attention of readers and critics. We can understand why a modern feminist critic might say that Guinevere emerges not as one participant in a complex tale of sin and betrayal as in Malory, but as almost sole cause of what has instead become a simple, not to say simplistic tragedy. Or why Elizabeth Brewer wrote that Tennyson humiliated Guinevere as only a male Victorian writer could. But what are the reactions of contemporary readers? They were generally, though not always, much more accepting of the need for Guenevere to grovel in guilt. In an 1859 review of Tennyson's Idylls of the King in the Westminster Review, for example, the reviewer quotes at length from Arthur's Nunnery monologue and asserts that writing like this, and that which concludes the poem, carries us beyond the region of criticism and praise. He who reads it well will read it alone in silence with a sense of awe and thoughts that lie deeper than tears. The image of the groveling Guenevere was familiar not only from the text in many editions of Tennyson's poems, but also from illustrations, such as those of Gustave Doré, for example, of Alfred Capus, and of Lewis Wollstonecraft Reed and George Reed. Lest we think that when we look at the imagery created around this scene, we only need substitute for Brewer's male writer the term male artist, we should note that even female artists depicted the groveling Guenevere. Florence Harrison does so in her illustrations for Guenevere and other poems by Tennyson. And Jessie King, in her illustrations to the Broadway booklets edition of the Guenevere Idyll, shows a magnanimous author forgiving a kneeling, we might say semi-groveling Guenevere. Another woman who depicted the groveling Guenevere was Amy Butts. Amy Butts, who in 1863 published a series of drawings based on Tennyson's 1859 volume. The Arthurian Annals is almost certainly correct in suggesting that these illustrations were originally probably made for the Art Union competition. In 1860, the Art Union of London sponsored a contest to illustrate the 1859 Idylls. A prize of 100 guineas for a series of designs in outline or outline slightly shaded was to be awarded to the winner. The 43 entries for a total of 540 drawings were exhibited publicly in London for 4 weeks. The series of 16 drawings by Paolo Priolo was chosen as the winner, and the drawings were subsequently published and presented to Art Union subscribers. Although Priolo did not draw the prostrate Guenevere, he did portray Guenevere's repentance as she enters the nunnery and as she watches Arthur depart after he visits her there. The groveling Guenevere was illustrated. Oops, sorry. The groveling Guenevere was illustrated by James Reed in another portfolio of drawings, never printing and existing only in manuscript, in what was almost surely a submission to the Art Union contest. Reed's drawings were clearly more amateurish than those of Priolo or Butts, and it is easy to see why his was not the winning entry. The fact that 43 artists created these illustrations and that the illustrations were exhibited attests to the popularity of Tennyson's Arthurian poems and demonstrates one of the many ways that images like that of Guenevere's groveling were presented to the public. Guenevere's humiliation figures again in one of a series of 12 tiles depicting scenes from the Idylls designed by John Moyer Smith for Minton. These tiles appeared in fireplaces, in furniture, in flower boxes, and as in the illustration here, in trivets. Thus, a Victorian housewife might lift her teapot and be cautioned by an image of Guenevere groveling before Arthur because she had been unfaithful. How popular the image was can also be demonstrated by the fact that in the Tokelin series of authors' illustrated cards produced in 1893, an Alfred Tennyson card is illustrated with an image of Guenevere groveling at Arthur's feet. Many contemporaries seem to have accepted Guenevere's humiliation as a defensive order in the household and order in the realm. But there were dissenting voices. A disapproving reference to the groveling Guinevere occurs in a review by George Bernard Shaw of the spectacular 1895 play King Arthur by J. Cummins Carr. A play that might be called the Camelot of its day. Referring to a scene in the play in which Arthur confronts Lancelot and Guinevere about their affair, not in a nunnery but at Camelot, Shaw says, when King Arthur, having broken down in an attempt to hit Lancelot with his sword, Guinevere groveling on the floor with her head within an inch of his toes, and stood plainly conveying to the numerous bystanders that this was the proper position for a female who had forgotten herself so far as to prefer another man to him, one's gorge rose at the Tappertitian vulgarity and infamy of the thing. That vision of a fine figure of a woman torn with sobs and remorse, stretched at the feet of a nobly superior and deeply wronged lord of creation, is no doubt still as popular with the men whose sentimental vanity it flatters as it was in the days of the Idylls of the King. The interesting thing about this reference to the groveling Guinevere is that in the printed version of Carr's play, there is no stage direction indicating such a posture for Guinevere. In fact, the only direction in that scene says that she stands immovable. But Shaw is accurately describing what occurred in the play, as an image from the Lyceum Theatre program affirms. And this staging to which Shaw refers must have been influenced by the nunnery scene in Tennyson, to which Shaw links it. As Shaw's review indicates, not all contemporary reactions were accepting of the exemplum of wifely duty and submission that the groveling Guinevere provided. F.J. Furnival, for example, in his preface to his edition of the Castel Sant Graal for the Roxburgh Club, reacts harshly to Tennyson's treatment of Arthur's queen. Furnival believes that someone who knows Malory knows that Arthur's own sin was the cause of the breaking up of the Round Table, and Guinevere's the means only through which that cause worked itself out. Furnival goes on to say, to come on Mr. Tennyson's representation of the king, in perfect words with tenderest pathos, rehearsing to his prostrate queen his own nose and her disgrace, the revulsion of feeling was too great. One was forced to say to the flower of kings, if you really did this, you were the Pecksniff of the period. I quite admit, he continues, that anyone, and especially Mr. Tennyson, who is to me personally more than all the other English poets put together, save alone Chaucer, has a right to take Arthur's nobleness from the early legend and Guinevere's sin from the later one and combine them together as he will. But I desire to point out that the early legend, which says nothing of Arthur's sin, says nothing of Guinevere's sin with Lancelot either, and that some, if not all, of the later legends which point out Guinevere's sin point out too Arthur's earlier incest, which in accordance with Merlin's prophecy must and does ruin his round table. Similar sympathy for Guinevere is found in two fascinating stories by women, one British and one American. A Victorian tale, which as J. Philip Eggers has observed, seems to anticipate the confrontation between Arthur and Guinevere in Tennyson, is Avilion. Which was written in 1853 by Dinah Maria Mulloch Craik. The tale tells of the journey of the sickly Wilfrid Mayor to the happy isles of Greek mythology, then to Avilion, or Avalon, before passing on to Edenland, all of which ends as a dream induced by medication. In Avilion, Wilfrid witnesses a meeting between Arthur and the shade of Guinevere. When Arthur speaks to her, he is cold, stern, passionless, even though she cries for mercy. When her spirit is conjured up by Merlin, he calls her, in a line foreshadowing Tennyson's scheme of the true and the false, a false queen, false wife, false woman. A twist on the conventional Victorian morality of this final meeting of Arthur and Guinevere is found in the sentiments of Galahad, who says, O men, sinful yourselves, yet so harsh to judge the sinning. Is there no pity in God's heaven for such as these? The convent cell at Almesbury yet bears record of the tears, the sackcloth, the bloody scourge, sad portion of her who was once a queen. The perspective provided by Galahad may be reflective of Craik's own position, a woman's pity for a woman scorned. A similar perspective is evident in the true story of Guenevere, a short story written in 1876 by an American woman, Elizabeth Stuart Phelps. Phelps observes that while Lancelot is given a spotless son, Guenevere is given the convent and solitary expiation. Prone upon the convent floor, our fancy leaves her, kissing Arthur's kingly and forgiving but departing feet. Phelps's story is told by a narrator who says she rebels against the story as told by Tennyson because she cannot bear to leave her, that is Guenevere, there upon the convent floor. This image becomes for Phelps a symbolic icon of the distorted relationship between man and woman, Guenevere groveling and yearning for forgiveness before the masterful, royal, almost divine Arthur. In the true story of Guenevere, Phelps appropriates to the female voice a traditionally male story. Phelps's true story of Guenevere, she says, came to her through her washerwoman, not from any of the number of male authors whom she names, authors such as Bulfinch, Ellis, Tennyson, or Dunlop, who tell of the Queen's shame. This rejection, both of the male voice and of class privileging, is in itself a comment on the original story and a means of achieving her truth about female characters. Phelps's author is translated into a master carpenter of the 19th century, just as her Lancelot, as all scholars of romantic fiction know, she says, was the young bricklayer to whom Arthur and Guenevere had rented the spare room when the hard times came on. Of her 19th century translation of The Blameless King, Phelps says, to tell the truth, Arthur was often dull of late, what with being out of work so much, and the foot he lamed with a rusty nail. Arthur's dullness extends to his understanding of his wife's needs. At times, he cannot be more mistaken about what she wants. When Guenevere suffers from a toothache, Arthur's advice is merely to take some drops. Phelps's Guenevere is mismated, not as in Tennyson, because Arthur is so far above the average man that he is unable to understand human needs and desires, but rather because he is typical of the average man, who for Phelps is unable to understand a woman's needs and desires. Lancelot, by contrast, is more active in trying to help her. He goes to the druggist and gets her laudanum to deal with the pain. Unfortunately, Guenevere cannot tolerate laudanum. In Phelps's true story, when Guenevere departs with her lover, she hears an old gossip saying, Guenevere has fled with Lancelot. The queen has left the king. All the world will know it by tomorrow. And immediately she feels pangs of guilt and considers herself an evil creature. She finds herself in a stormy wilderness with no one but Lancelot, but even Lancelot is no comfort to her. But then a vision appears to her, one of Christ, who says to her that though your sins are scarlet, they shall be white. Having begged divine forgiveness, Guenevere has apparently received it, but in a striking reversal, almost as if the word of Christ cannot be trusted, she finds no redemption. She is in the same position towards Christ that Tennyson's Guenevere is towards Arthur. She groveled on the ground where the sacred feet had stood, which now were banished from her. It is left to the narrator, or the washerwoman who is her source, to give Guenevere what little relief she can obtain. Guenevere wakes to find herself in Arthur's sheltering arms. She has been redeemed by the storyteller's suggestion that her running off with Lancelot occurred in a nightmare induced when she took laudanum for her toothache. Thus she can wake morally unblemished. The ending raises Guenevere from the convent floor. She is not left groveling or in disgrace, exile, and despair, but neither has she attained a totally fulfilling life. Guenevere is better off in such a relationship with her husband as the washerwoman, the female narrator, and Phelps all seem to be saying. The price, however, is certainly high. She must accept the limitations that that relationship with a man with typical 19th century attitudes implies. Guinevere has attained a modicum of peace and respectability, but she has not achieved the grail of female fulfillment. Phelps's fiction suggests that this ideal is not yet something women can achieve in this world. How deeply the scene of Guinevere's groveling affected Phelps is demonstrated not only by the fact that she wrote the true story of Guinevere, but also by her reworking of the icon in her play Within the Gates. In this play, a husband verbally and emotionally mistreats his loving wife just before he is killed in a buggy accident. After death, he realizes his error and cannot partake of the joys of paradise because his wife is not there with him. When she dies and appears before him in heaven, she seems tall and glorious. Her expression is radiant. She is to him like a goddess. He, like Tennyson's Guinevere, is prostrate at his wife's feet, yearning for forgiveness, which she grants when she approaches him, not royally like a wife who was wronged, but like the sweetest woman in the world who loves him because she cannot help it and would not if she could. This scene clearly inverts the dynamic of Tennyson's characters, with the husband groveling before the wife who forgives magnanimously the wrong done to her, and who, despite her royal and near divine position in the relationship, acts like a loving partner. Thus Phelps provides a rebuke to the stern imperiousness of Tennyson's author. Another one who is perhaps less critical of Guinevere is illustrator Eleanor Fortescue Brickdale. In Brickdale's depiction of Guinevere in the Nunnery, Guinevere is not confined to a dark, restrictive, and perhaps symbolically labyrinthine convent, as is sometimes the case, as, for example, in an illustration by Gustave Doré or by Innes Fripp. Rather, in Brickdale's illustration, Guinevere appears outdoors. The image is replete with texture, from the rough stones of the low wall behind her to the tiles on the roof. These simple details combine with the beautiful flowers and the loaves of bread in the basket she holds to give a sense that life goes on even after the tragedy she has endured, the sadness of which can be seen in her face. Surely Brickdale was familiar with the popular tradition of depicting Guinevere groveling, if only because she was a student of Herbert Bohn, who designed a series of tapestries with scenes from the Idylls, one of which depicted Guinevere groveling at Arthur's feet. Yet Brickdale chose not to depict Guinevere in such a posture of repentance and regret. Several playwrights have recognized the dramatic potential of the meeting between Arthur and Guinevere and have included the encounter in their works. British poet and playwright Savory Levy, in his pageant play Guinevere and Arthur, adapted from Tennyson's Last Tournament, Guinevere and Passing of Arthur, reproduces Arthur's Nunnery monologue directly from Tennyson, with Guinevere's groveling indicated by stage directions. Others dramatize Arthur's visit to the nunnery with a different dynamic from that created by Tennyson. In these works, the playwrights examine the tension caused by Guinevere's marriage to a man who is said to be the blameless king. It is as if they agreed with Shaw's reaction to Guinevere's groveling in Carr's play. In his review of the play, Shaw said that since the Idylls were published, we have been learning that a woman is something more than a piece of sweet stuff to fatten a man's emotions, and our amateur king authors are beginning to realize, with shocked surprise, that the more generous the race grows, the stronger becomes its disposition to bring them to their senses with a stinging dose of wholesome ridicule. In a number of plays, Guinevere enters into dialogue with Arthur, and in some plays, Arthur assumes at least some of the guilt. Much of the plot of the 1895 play Mordred by British playwright Henry Newbolt is based on Malory, but Newbolt draws from Tennyson the final meeting between Arthur and Guenevere at the Nunnery. Newbolt's presentation of this meeting is, however, quite different from Tennyson's. Rather than portraying a groveling Guenevere, Newbolt's character enters into a dialogue with the king, and in contrast to Tennyson's Arthur's godlike forgiveness of his queen, he actually asks for forgiveness, an appropriate response since, as she tells him, the knowledge of thy sin had burned my heart to ashes, the sin being Arthur's siring of Mordred, a detail adopted in this scene from Tennyson from Malory and not Tennyson. American playwright and poet Stark Young dramatized the relationship between Lancelot and Guenevere in his 1906 play Guenevere, which is based largely on Malory, but which includes Tennysonian touches. The play, like Tennyson's Idyll, is named for Guenevere, and it focuses on the strife caused by her love for Lancelot and her internal struggle between the worldly and the spiritual. In his fifth act, Young presents Lancelot's visit to the nunnery with details from Malory, such as Lancelot's request for a final kiss, Guinevere's denial of that request, and Lancelot's assertion that he will spend the rest of his life in a hermitage. But this occurs only after a fourth act visit by Arthur to the nunnery. Young, however, does not present Guinevere groveling on the convent floor, while a superior Arthur speaks of how she has spoiled the perfect kingdom he planned. Arthur recognizes that they share the blame for the downfall of Camelot, and Guinevere enters into a dialogue with him and even instructs him. In the end, the scene is the culmination of the conflict within Guinevere. It reveals that she still loves Arthur, that she still is drawn to the world of chivalry as much as, or more than, the world of spirit, and that now she can be happy in neither. I've lost both kingdoms, she proclaims, as she rips off the veil and the sacred heart she wore. Despite using Malory as his primary source, Young cannot resist the dramatic Tennysonian confrontation between Arthur and Guinevere in the nunnery. British poet and playwright Lawrence Binyon's 1923, getting ahead of myself. 1923 tragedy Arthur is like Stark Young's play, based primarily on Malory. The play deals with the final events of Arthur's reign, from the tragic love of Elaine of Astolat for Lancelot until the death of Arthur, largely as Malory had conceived of them. The eighth of the 9 scenes that comprise the play, however, departs from Malory's account to present the dramatic Tennysonian encounter between Arthur and Guinevere at Amesbury. The scene begins with Guinevere lying prostrate on stone steps in the convent, not in abject submission and apology to Arthur, but rather in sorrow and repentance. When Arthur arrives, she is no longer prostrate, nor is she silent, even though his appearance is otherworldly. For Binyon, Arthur seems almost like a spirit, and he has an exalted, strange, and almost transfigured air. And yet Guinevere does not grovel before him, but enters into a dialogue with him, in which she admits that in her heart she does not repent of all that she has done. Guinevere and Arthur both accept some of the blame for the tragic events that brought about Camelot's downfall, and Arthur asks her forgiveness. It is striking that in a play that borrows so little from Arthurian tradition outside of the Morte d'Arthur, and that is so dependent on Malory for its structure, its characterization, and even some of its dialogue, the dramatically powerful meeting of the king and the queen in the nunnery is adapted from Tennyson, even if their relationship is given a somewhat more modern twist. A much later reaction to Tennyson's Guinevere groveling is found in John Boorman's film Excalibur, which, despite its acknowledgement of Malory as its source, owes a debt to Tennyson as well. In the film, Arthur rides to the nunnery to ask Guinevere to accept his forgiveness and to put her heart at rest. He proclaims that he has always loved her and that he does, to which she responds, "I loved you as king, sometimes as husband," and then adds, "One cannot gaze too long at the sun." The line echoes Tennyson's Guinevere's mitigation of her actions, but who can gaze upon the sun in heaven? But here is spoken directly to Arthur, who feels the need to ask forgiveness when the thought is voiced, and then to explain that he was not born to live a man's life, but to be the stuff of legends. The scene in Excalibur is obviously derived from Tennyson's depiction of Arthur's visit to Almesbury, but the dynamic between the characters is completely different. Guinevere does not grovel silently, but speaks her mind and even her mild criticism of Arthur, who does not accuse or berate her, but hopes that in the hereafter of our lives, when I owe no more to the future, can be just a man that we may meet. You'll come to me and claim me yours and know that I am your husband. And in this scene, Guinevere returns Excalibur to Arthur, saying simply, I kept it, and not rehearsing the details of its being left plunged into earth by the king between the sleeping lovers. Thus, in this meeting, there is none of the accusation, none of the groveling guilt, but an honest exchange and an admission, as Arthur says, that we've suffered too long. And instead of spoiling the purpose of his life, she helps him to fulfill it by returning to him the sword Excalibur. Though the image of the groveling Guinevere is disturbing to modern readers, as it was to some Victorians, Tennyson saw the dramatic potential of a final meeting between Arthur and Guinevere. While other Victorians praised or criticized, directly or indirectly, the way in which he presented this meeting, the very fact that he created such a scene as part of a shift in focus to Guinevere and the other female characters opened up the possibility for future authors and artists to reinterpret or reconceive the Arthurian legends in a way that gives female characters greater agency, importance, and complexity. It is perhaps indicative of Tennyson's particular fascination with Arthur's queen, that while the names of the original four Idylls were changed to give prominence and even primacy to male characters, Enid becoming Geraint and Enid, Vivian becoming Merlin and Vivian, and Elaine becoming Lancelot and Elaine, Tennyson did not add a male name to the title Guinevere. Perhaps this is because Guinevere's influence, for good or ill, is felt in most of the Idylls. Just as Lancelot is central to Malory's vision of the Arthurian world, so Guinevere is, as David Staines has argued, the center of Tennyson's Arthurian world and the controlling force in the structural development, indeed in the very creation of that world. Tennyson's Arthurian poems quickly became co-canonical with Malory's Mort as a source for Arthurian literature and art in the English and American traditions. The conflation of the influence of Tennyson with that of Malory leads to important changes and developments in late 19th and 20th century Arthuriana, including an increased interest in the women of the legend. As Elizabeth Brewer has observed, Tennyson's Guinevere, humiliated though she is, remains a majestic figure, impressive in her contrition and her sorrow. And that majesty, coupled with her centrality to Tennyson's Arthuriad, is at least part of what has made her so attractive a subject for later writers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. This is absolutely fabulous. Thank you.